Do Buddhists celebrate feast days of any other important religious figures?
In China, Japan, and Tibet especially, Buddhists hold feasts in honor of various bodhisattvas and holy persons. The death anniversary of Bodhidharma, traditionally believed to be the founding patriarch of Chinese Zen, occurs on the 5th day of the 10th lunar month, Bhadrapada, August/September. Events in the life of Tibetan Buddhism's important patriarch Padmasambhava provide a kind of narrative. Sacred structure for the entire year with special observances occurring on the 10th day of each lunar month. Devotees celebrate his flight from the world in the first month, his taking of religious vows in the second, and his miraculous transformation of fire into water during the third, for example. One of the most widely celebrated sacred persons is the Bodhisattva Guanyin, called Kannon in Japan. Her special day is the 19th of a given lunar month, with her birthday occurring during the second month. Her enlightenment during the 6th, and her entry into nirvana during the 9th.
Has Daoism ever been identified with any political regimes?
During several periods of Chinese history, Daoism has enjoyed the considerable benefits of imperial patronage. One Daoist emperor in particular, during the mid-9th century, launched a devastating persecution of Buddhism that did serious damage to many of that tradition's institutions. There is a certain irony in that, given the classical Daoist teaching about law and government. According to the Dao De Jing and Zhuangzi, the best hope for society is unobtrusive leadership that does not need to rely on law and force to lead. Governmental institutions are meddlesome and oppressive. According to early Daoist authorities, the ideal social setting is the small village in which no one carries weapons. Very unlike classical Confucian tradition in this respect. The ideal Daoist society does away with social stratification of all kinds. Where all are equal, ruling and military classes are unnecessary. Throughout Chinese history, however, Daoists and Confucians have competed with one another for imperial support and patronage. Confucianism generally has been far more closely identified with government than has Daoism. Despite classical Daoist aversion to formal structures of government, both the official and popular pantheons have retained a good deal of the imagery of imperial bureaucracy. As in the names of such deities as the Jade Emperor.
Are there days devoted to other aspects of Buddhist teaching?
On the full moon day of the third lunar month of Magha, some Buddhists commemorate Buddha's teaching of the monastic disciplinary code called the Vinaya. Thais celebrate by circumambulating the Chaitya and listening to a sermon in the temple. Theravada Buddhists celebrate the Buddha's first sermon on the full moon day of Asita. 8th lunar month, by revering the scriptural text. Some schools celebrate days dedicated to their central scriptures. For example, the denomination named after the Japanese reformer Nichiren 1222-82 honors the Lotus of the Good Law Sutra, as do other groups in China and Japan. Monasteries typically celebrate anniversaries of their founding, and in some countries, a festive day marks the anniversary of Buddhism's arrival with the first missionaries. Members of the Jodo Shinshu, True Pure Land, sect remember their founder Shinran 1173-1262, on the 16th of each month, and with a week-long memorial every year in either January or November.
What is a mandala? Is it the same as a thangka?
Mandala is a Sanskrit word for circle. As a two-dimensional design, a mandala is equivalent to the plan of a stupa. Viewed directly from above, a stupa reveals a series of alternating concentric square and circular shapes. From the outside in, you see the square foundation, the circular earth mound, the square altar inside its square railing, and finally the circular discs mounted on the shaft of the spire. Some mandalas depict 4 gates on the sides of the foundation square and add yet another outer circle symbolizing the 8 cemeteries through which a meditator must first pass, becoming oblivious to the senses and all other distractions before entering the sacred space. Vajrayana and other esoteric Buddhist sects adapted this bird's-eye perspective on the stupa and interpreted it as an image of both the macrocosm, the whole spiritual cosmos, and the microcosm, the individual meditator. Devotees meditate on the sacred design of the spiritual city as they move symbolically inward from the gates toward the center and enlightenment. Various deities and forms of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are depicted in the different spaces of the mandala, each symbolizing some aspect of spiritual power. Tibetan monks sometimes create large mandalas using grains of colored sand. After many hours of work, they conduct rituals around it and then discard it in a river as a reminder of impermanence and non-attachment. Thangka is a more generic term for a Tibetan wall hanging depicting a religious theme. Some thangkas depict mandalas, and some display sacred imagery of other kinds. Multiple scenes illustrating Jataka tales offer material designed for meditation on essential virtues modeled by the Buddha to be.
What observances are linked with seasonal cycles?
The so-called rain retreat, Vasa, begins on the day after the full moon day of the 8th lunar month, Asada, July/August, and continues until the full moon day of the 11th lunar month Ashvina, September/October. Monks spend more time in meditation and study and are expected to remain in the monastery. Lay Buddhists visit temples and monasteries more frequently than usual to receive instruction. and marriages are generally not performed. Theravada Buddhists begin the season with monastic ordinations and end it with special merit rituals said to be in memory of Buddha's emergence from heaven. Also at the end of the retreat comes the festival called Kadhana, cloth. During this joyous month-long festivity, lay people give the monks new robes and other useful gifts. This is a favored time for pilgrimages to Southeast Asian sites such as Rangoon's Shui Dagon Temple and Thailand's Shrine of the Buddha's Footprint. In connection with the rice harvest in February or March, Theravada devotees make merit by celebrating the story of how the Buddha-to-be entered the world as Prince Vesanthara in a previous incarnation.
What about observances related to the locality or indigenous practice?
In many parts of the world, Buddhists celebrate New Year's Day on January 1st. The observance is not a specifically Buddhist tradition but has become associated with it through a process of syncretism. Japanese Buddhists observe the spring and autumn equinoxes on March 21st and September 21st respectively. A festival honoring the dead, called Abon Matsuri, occurs between July 13th and 15th. Chinese All Souls Day. A parallel festivity, celebrated during the 7th lunar month. Features offerings thought to assist 7 generations of deceased relatives. A good example of an observance linked specifically to a single region is the celebration of Buddhist Churches of America Founding Day on September 1st.
What is Neo-Daoism?
Neo-Daoism is a name commonly given to various developments around the 3rd and 4th centuries CE. Some scholars suggest that there were 2 recognizable schools. One was called secret mystical teaching, Xian Shui. According to some interpreters, an important theme was its emphasis on the quest for physical immortality. Earlier Daoist sources had spoken of immortality, but generally of the spiritual rather than the bodily sort. Neo-Daoism recommended exercises in breathing, diet, use of potions, elixirs, and talismans, and sexual activity reminiscent of Hindu and Buddhist tantric practices. But perhaps more fundamental in this alchemy were intense meditative practices intended to reveal the Dao within the individual. Some scholars interpret Xian Shui as developing out of Confucian rather than Daoist thought. A major feature of the second school, known as pure conversation, Qingtian, is its attempts to blend aspects of Daoist, Confucian, and Buddhist thought. Among its proponents were the so-called 7 sages of the bamboo grove, whose penchant for detached philosophical discourse and the cultivation of a Daoist aesthetic were among their hallmarks. On the basis of their reading of the Zhuangzi and Dao De Jing, they developed a neo-Daoist interpretation of the so-called Confucian classics. After the 5th century, Buddhist concepts infiltrated the movement to such a degree that Neo-Daoism gradually lost its distinctiveness and identity.
What signs or symbols distinguish Buddhist ritual specialists?
Priests who officiate in Buddhist temples that serve the public wear a variety of colors and use various implements. Priests often wear a special robe called a kashaya, kesa in Japan. The vestment is unusual in that it is typically a patchwork of many colors and textures. Recalling the simplicity and poverty of the Buddha's earliest disciples. An abbreviated form of the kesa is the waijisa, a simple swatch of cloth worn over the shoulders. Some monastic priests in Japan carry a staff called a shakuja. 6 metal rings near the top make a jangling sound, alerting small defenseless creatures to remove themselves from harm's way. The Bodhisattva Jizo, usually dressed as a monk or priest, typically carries the staff. Within private or monastic settings, ritual specialists have an even greater diversity of signs and symbols. Since their rituals are often more esoteric and complex. Tibetan monks, for example, don very colorful headgear distinctive of their various lineages for special rituals. Tibetans and members of other esoteric sects also use a wider variety of special ritual objects than are used in popular denominations.
What is a day in the life of a Buddhist monastery like?
Daily monastic rituals vary somewhat according to place and denomination. Theravada monasteries revolve around the chanting of scriptures from the first 2 baskets. The Vinaya and Sutra Pitakas. After waking at around 3 a.m. members lie prostrate together in the oratory to recite the 3 refuges and chant sutras. They spend several hours in study and meditation before heading out to beg. Breakfast precedes more communal chanting and a class on the rules of discipline. Supper is scheduled before noon, after which members spend the afternoon studying scripture and resting. More chanting, study, and prayer, along with a chance to once again examine the conscience and confess faults, bring the day to a close by 10. Theravada monks in many areas engage in considerable social service activity, assisting villagers in various kinds of practical projects and in community organization. In places like Japan, monks leave the monastery on a quest for alms that is more a symbolic reminder of their dependence than a substantial necessity. Daily order is strictly regulated with relatively little time for individual activities. Certain days are designated for shaving and bathing. Zen monks engage in periods of manual labor around the monastery, such as gardening, gathering fuel, and general maintenance, and place greater emphasis on silent meditation than on recitation of scriptural texts. Each month a whole week is dedicated to virtually round-the-clock zazen, or sitting meditation, together in the same hall where the monks sleep. Monastic life generally allows sufficient sleep and nutritious food to maintain good health. But nothing superfluous in either case. It is a physically and psychologically demanding life. In most cases, individuals can join a monastery for a time, with the understanding that they do not intend to make a lifelong commitment to it.
Are doctrine and dogma important to Daoism or CCT?
Most of the various schools and sects of Daoism can point to at least one source or compendium of their central teachings. In that sense, there is such a thing as Daoist doctrine. A body of doctrine does, in effect, define the boundaries of some of the schools, especially the more esoteric ones, and sets them apart from one another. But even in those instances, the doctrinal core is largely subordinate to a given school's central rituals and practices. CCT, on the other hand, does not define itself according to any clearly articulated doctrinal system. Children learn from their parents and extended family of elders a host of convictions and practices of the sort often called folk beliefs. Where there is no formally defined doctrine, there can be no dogma in the sense of a minimum required for membership. Of those Daoist schools and sects that have developed distinctive doctrinal tenets, only the most esoteric have even approached the kind of official dogmatic pronouncement one finds, for example, in Roman Catholicism.
What do Daoists believe about ultimate spiritual reality or God?
Daoists call the ultimate spiritual reality Deo, the way. Long before the formal beginnings of Daoism's various movements and school, Chinese tradition used the term Dao as a general ethical notion implying the appropriate and moral way of acting. As so often happens when a religious tradition enters a new cultural setting, Buddhism's arrival in China led some thinkers to talk of a Buddhist way in contrast with which they began to define an indigenous Chinese way in the sense of religious beliefs and values. Daoist philosophers emphasized the unfathomable mystery of the Dao, but they viewed it as non-personal power rather than a personal divine entity. The religious equivalent seems to have been a deity called the Supreme Oneness, Tai Yi. The Dao De Jing's description of how the transcendent Dao became manifest suggests a type of emanation. Dao gave rise to the One, which produced the Two, and so on. That grand and uplifting description of the ultimate mystery still remained a bit too abstract for most people. As a result, when the first schools of religious Daoism began to formulate their beliefs, they naturally gravitated toward more concrete imagery. That included the deification of the individual, long believed to represent the way as an accessible teaching, namely Lao Zi. The process also led to personification of certain essential Features of the mysterious Dao in the form of the heavenly triad called the Three Pure Ones. Developments of this sort multiplied, and the deities took on life stories and personalities that invited devotional interaction. In practice, the many personifications of divinity are arrayed according to an administrative structure parallel to that of the imperial bureaucracy. Religiously speaking, of course, the reality is just the other way round. The imperial institutions imitated the heavenly order of things.
Where do Buddhists go to get the various signs and symbols they use often?
Wherever Buddhism has been an important part of a culture, Buddhists can easily find stores that specialize in religious goods and devotional objects. Walk down any number of streets in cities like Kyoto, Japan, or Keelung, Taiwan, for example, and you may find yourself passing such a shop. Japanese Buddhist goods stores tend to carry exclusively Buddhist items. Most prominently, on display are images of the Buddha, usually of Amida, and of various bodhisattvas. To install the images at home or the office, one can buy altars and shrines built like miniature temples, with several shelves inside and doors that can be closed. In Taiwan, where Buddhism so often blends together with Taoist and popular folk traditions, items of interest to Buddhist devotees frequently appear, interspersed with images of the Eight Immortals and other Chinese religious figures. Religious goods stores offer devotional items in several sizes and price ranges. Small pieces suitable for homes of modest income or full-size images designed for temples with sizable congregations.
Did Daoist tradition spread beyond China?
Daoism has exerted some influence at various times all over East and Southeast Asia. Wherever Chinese have traveled, Daoism has gone and left its mark. But it rarely has made its presence felt dramatically outside of China and territories under Chinese control. Daoist teachings, however, have had a significant impact on Chinese Buddhism over the centuries. Buddhism in turn has transported those usually well-hidden contributions on its missionary road throughout Asia. In relatively recent times, Daoism, and teachings that claim to be Daoist, have begun to enjoy increasing popularity in Europe and the Americas, but on a much smaller scale than other traditions of Asian origin.
What rites do Buddhists practice at home?
Many devout Buddhists pray daily at home before their domestic shrine, a miniature version of the temple or monastic oratory. They show reverence to the image of the Buddha with incense, flower offerings, and a lighted candle. All three of these simple symbols bring home the central realization of impermanence. They give pleasure to the worshipper, who should enjoy them while they last. Unburned incense is analogous a person who does not use his or her talents. A lotus flower is a reminder of the Buddha's being rooted in the muck of real life but blossoming above it and in spite of it. These symbols also represent homage to the Buddha, not because the Buddha needs or enjoys that, but because it focuses the mind on his message. Rituals also include reciting the 3 refuges and reaffirming the commitment to the 5 precepts. Prayers of petition include the same sorts of things people of many traditions ask for: happiness, success, longevity, and salvation. Mahayana devotees might wear a small rosary around a wrist, as they often do when worshipping in the temple.
What is the Buddhist rosary?
Buddhists in many places have used a number of variations on the string of beads for devotional purposes. In ancient India, Buddhists used a string of 108 beads. Very similar to the ancient Hindu rosary, as a symbol of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. This compassionate being, whose name means, roughly, Lord looking down on the world, took on 108 human characteristics in his saving descent to assume the human condition, using the beads while doing so. Chinese and Japanese images of the Buddha, as well as of various patriarchs and monastic founders, sometimes show them holding rosaries for ritual purposes. The rosary has been particularly important in the more esoteric sects of Tibet and Japan. Tibetan rosaries have 3 larger beads at the end as symbols of the 3 jewels. Devotees in those sects use the beads to count repetitions of their mantras. In some more popular sects, devotees count repetitions of names of the Buddha or phrases like "Glory to Amida Buddha."
What's the difference between a stupa and a pagoda?
A stupa is an ancient Indian burial or reliquary monument. Its fundamental unit is a solid hemispherical earthen mound called the egg, anda, or womb, garbha. Atop the mound sits a solid square or rectangular shape, originally surrounded by a 4-sided railing, called the harmika, that may be a remnant of the days when the village altar stood inside a fenced enclosure. Growing tree-like from that is a pillar that pierces several circular discs of decreasing diameter, usually an odd number from 3 to 11. The result looks like a multi-tiered parasol. The Buddha's cremated remains are said to have been originally enshrined in a large number of stupas built all over India. Mahayana teaching developed the notion that the Buddha was a cosmic spiritual being, rather than a mere human teacher, and the architecture of the stupa evolved to reflect those changes. Stupa designers began to raise the mound off the ground by using several square bases, meanwhile stretching the mound itself upward much the way a potter turns a round lump of clay into a tall graceful vase. The parasol is also stretched heavenward, becoming more streamlined and adding discs. When Mahayana Buddhism moved into China, architects transformed the upper portion of the stupa into an independent structure, turning the multiple discs into roofs. The earth-hugging funerary mound was replaced by the pagoda. The new structure was derived from the stupa and still contained relics. But the pagoda symbolized transcendence rather than earthly existence. Pagodas soon added their own sets of multiple discs, leaving the stupa, so to speak, in the dust. In the Theravada lands of Southeast Asia, reminders of the stupa remain in the gently tapered monuments of Burma and Thailand. Mahayana Buddhist establishments all over East Asia identify themselves with their graceful, multi-roofed pagodas. Unlike the typical stupa, the pagoda actually has interior space, sometimes on several levels.
Is there a standard Buddhist liturgical worship?
Buddhist denominations that emphasize communal worship exhibit considerable variation in their services. Recitation of sacred texts is the single most common element. One Japanese Pure Land denomination uses the following order of service. After a call to worship expressing prayerful intent, worshippers pronounce the three refuges. Invoke the presence of the Buddha, praise him. Make a symbolic confession of sins, and recite the name of Amida Buddha 10 times. Then follows a segment of scriptural chanting, explicitly dedicated to rebirth in the Pure Land. Again invoking the name of Amida Buddha 10 times, worshippers reflect on its deeper meaning. Between two further invocations of the name they recite from the teachings of founder Honen. After a recitation of the vows of the Bodhisattva, the ritual concludes with the three refuges and a final prayer to send the Buddha back to his heavenly abode.
Who was Lao Zi?
Lao Zi was likely an altogether legendary figure whose name simply means old teacher or master. Tradition says he was born around 604 BCE, making him a much older contemporary of Confucius. Kongfu Zi, 551 to 479 BCE, who was in turn an almost exact contemporary of the Buddha. The legend says Lao Zi was a clerk in the archives of the Zhou dynasty who practiced the way and its power and emphasized self-effacement and anonymity. When he became convinced that social disintegration and political corruption in the Zhou dynasty were irreversible, he decided to withdraw from society. Riding his water buffalo, the old man came to the frontier. There a customs officer besought him to write down his lofty teachings before departing. Lao Zi wrote the Dao De Jing, the classic of the way and its power, and disappeared, leaving a legacy of mystery. Much later stories, perhaps from a time when Daoists and Confucians were in competition for followers, tell of a meeting between Lao Zi and a youthful Confucius. No use wasting so much time studying your history, Lao Zi counseled the newcomer. Observe nature and you will see that love for the Dao is all that one needs. Popular tradition tends to identify Lao Zi as the one who first taught that ordinary folk could seek and attain immortality. Some scholars suggest that Lao Zi's legendary stature may have been enhanced as a result of his mistaken identification with the legendary Huangdi, known as the Yellow Emperor who ruled in the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE. Lao Zi was officially declared a god around 666 CE.
What are the feasts of the Buddha?
Buddhists in various places commemorate 3 important events in the Buddha's life: his birth, his enlightenment, and his entry into nirvana. Theravada Buddhists celebrate them all on the same day, called simply Buddha Day, on the full moon day of Vaishakha, April/May. Some Mahayana groups hold separate festivities on fixed dates, with Buddha's birth observed on April 8, called Hanamatsuri in Japan. His enlightenment, called Bodhi Day, on December 8. And his final entry into nirvana on February 15. Religious activities on these occasions include special gatherings in monastery temples. Devotees bathe images of the Buddha, listen to narratives of the Buddha's life, circumambulate his relics enshrined either in large structures called chaitayas or small stupa or pagoda-shaped reliquaries, and water small Bodhi trees. Theravadins combine the festivities because tradition says that all 3 events occurred on the same day in different years. In Theravada Southeast Asia, Buddha Day remains associated with the onset of the monsoon rains and the planting of the rice crop.
What other early sacred texts are especially important for Daists?
A text known as the Zhuangzi, named after the man whose disciples may have authored it, dates from about the 4th century BCE. The work is also known as the Divine Classic of Nanhua, the town to which Zhuangzi was believed to have retired. Zhuangzi, the Daoist philosopher, c. 389–286 BCE, remains a relatively little-known figure. But the work that bears his name stands out as a foundational document in philosophical Daoism, whose interpretation of basic concepts also influenced many religious Daists. In addition to its bold attacks on the inadequacy of Confucian teaching, the Zhuangzi presents essentially the same worldview as the Dao De Jing, especially the importance of non-effort, wu wei, or unmotivated action and its political implications. Zhuangzi emphasizes the concepts of longevity and immortality that would later take on great significance for many religious Daists. Perhaps more important is the concept of mental purification called fasting of the heart. Zhuangzi's teaching has become an important element in Daoist mysticism. Speaking often of a kind of oneness with the Dao. A Daoist philosopher named Li Zi is likewise said to have penned a work that bears his name. That book, also known as the true classic of the expanding emptiness, however, was almost certainly of a later time, and Li Zi is probably a legendary figure. Containing materials of many different literary types, especially narrative forms such as anecdotes and parables, the book was probably compiled around 300 CE. Its 8 chapters arrange their literarily disparate materials thematically, addressing such topics as fate and human freedom, problems in establishing ethical standards, and the challenge of following the Dao. Here for the first time we hear of the Isles of the Blessed, home of the immortals. Like the Zhuangzi, the later work speaks at length about the complete freedom experienced in becoming one with the Dao.
Do Buddhists engage in ritual sacrifice?
Sacrifice has never been part of mainstream Buddhist ritual. The Buddha himself rejected the ancient Hindu sacrificial heritage as spiritually bankrupt, as did many others among his contemporaries. Some later popular devotional Hindu sects retained animal sacrifice as an essential feature of ritual. But Theravada and Mahayana popular devotion have, in effect, spiritualized the concept of sacrifice. Traditional forms of sacrifice typically aim to appease a divine power. Buddhist tradition virtually does away with the concept. When worshippers make offerings of flowers, incense, and other symbols, they are not giving gifts to a spiritual power but offering signs of reverence and providing reminders for themselves of life's impermanence.
What rites do Buddhists practice in the temple?
Some of the ordinary ritual activity that occurs in most Buddhist temples is communal. Congregational chanting of mantras or singing of hymns occasionally plays an important role. But a great deal of Buddhist temple ritual remains relatively unscheduled and highly individualized. Worshippers in Theravada temples sit or bow before the Buddha image and recite traditional prayers in praise of the historical Buddha. Devotees often hold as an offering a candle, flower, food, or a small parasol, symbols of respect for royalty. Offerings of flowers are particularly helpful reminders of impermanence, since they invariably wither and fade. Worshippers generally regard sacred images as aids to prayer and often also as possessing certain magical powers, but the image is not itself the Buddha. Theravada ritual aims to overcome the suffering born of inappropriate craving. Some temples have wall murals depicting scenes from the Jataka tales, each one exemplifying one essential virtue. Worshippers can meditate on these scenes in succession and ponder the ethical implications. Since the Buddha was like an extinct fire that needs no more fuel, people do not worship him as such. Theravada temple ritual is meant to dispose the devotee for greater spiritual development. Popular Mahayana rituals are similar in some outward respects, but they focus on the Buddha and Bodhisattvas as repositories of saving grace and power. Worship is a means to assure rebirth in one of the Buddha lands. Rituals emphasize the need to surrender entirely to saving grace and boundless compassion. Ritual helps overcome ignorance of the ultimate sources of transforming spiritual power. Mahayana temples often display multiple images, sometimes having several walls lined with statues. Devotees can pay their respects to each, waving an incense wand clasped between folded hands as a gesture of veneration.
What is the main source of information on Lao Tzu's life?
The main source of information on Lao Tzu's life is a biography written by the historian Si Ma Chen, 145–86 b. CE, in his Records of the Historian. By this time a number of beliefs about the founder of Chinese Daoism were circulating, and Si Ma Chen himself was unsure of their authenticity. The biography, in fact, contains an account of not one, but 3, men called Lao Tzu. The first Lao Tzu was a man named Li Er or Lao Dan who came from the village of Churen in the southern Chinese state of Chu. Li Er served as historian in charge of the official archives in the Chinese imperial capital of Luoyang. He was a contemporary of Confucius and is reported to have granted an interview to the Confucian master when he came to Luoyang seeking information on the Zhou ritual. Another man identified as the founder of Daoism was Lao Lai Zi, who also came from Chu. He is designated as a contemporary of Confucius and is credited with a 15-chapter book expounding on the teachings of the Daoist school. Nothing more is known about him. According to a third account, the original Lao Tzu lived 129 years after the death of Confucius. This man went by the name of Tan, the historian of Zhou. Scroll volumes. Every imaginable variety of text is available in the modern 60-volume reprint of the canon. 12 subdivisions arrange the material as follows: primal revelations, talismans, scriptural interpretation, or exegesis, sacred diagrams, historical texts, ethical texts, ritual texts, practical techniques, biographical information, sacred songs, and memorials. Most of the various sects and schools of Daoism focus on one or a select few of the many possibilities the canon offers. As we shall see later, recitation or chanting of sacred texts forms an important part of some ritual observances.
Is there a Daoist or CCT creed?
Since religious Daoism and CCT emphasize practice over correct belief, They have not formulated the equivalent of creedal summaries such as those of Judaism, Islam, and even Buddhism. Daoism and CCT do, of course, presuppose certain basic beliefs and assumptions about how the world works. Most of those beliefs have to do with discerning and understanding how to cope with and benefit from the spiritual forces inherent in all things. All of the varieties of religious Daoism and CCT, therefore, have their core beliefs. But affirming one's assent to them pales in insignificance when compared to the importance of grasping the essential skills needed to negotiate life's daily challenges.
What is the Daoism?
Daoist stories of how the world came to be are full of mythic features similar to those of other cosmogonies. They tell how order overcame chaos, how the heavens and earth came to be separated, and how the innumerable deities 36,000 according to one reckoning fit into the grand picture. What is unique and most interesting about Daoist myth is that the gods do not necessarily take an active role in cosmic affairs. They do not intervene in the unfolding cosmos, nor even nudge the process along, for that matter. Instead, they allow the fundamental laws of creation itself to operate unimpeded. Indeed, the gods themselves come into being as part of this whole unfolding set in motion by an impersonal power called heaven.
Do Buddhists mark their sacred spaces with any distinctive signs and symbols?
Though Buddhist ritual spaces vary a great deal architecturally and decoratively from one region to another, a number of commonly used signs and symbols appear. Perhaps the single most important is the eight-spoked wheel of the Dharma, reminder of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Noble Path. Tibetan temples identify themselves with a characteristic form of the classical Indian stupa called a chorten, a five-level architectural form crowned with a conical shape. Chinese Buddhist temples borrowed their ground plans from the traditional royal residence, a walled enclosure with one or more interior courtyards surrounding the main sacred structures. The principal inner structures face south and are lined up on an axis with the main gate. A multi-storied polygonal pagoda may be part of the complex. Japan largely borrowed the classical Chinese ground plan, varying the placement of the inner buildings somewhat. Always found at the back of the walled enclosure is the main image hall where central rituals occur. 3-5 or 7-story square pagodas are a regular feature in the main courtyard of many Japanese temples. Thai temples feature a very distinctive roofline and post very imposing guardian figures before the main door but do not generally have separate pagoda structures.
Is the term revelation useful in understanding Daoism or CCT?
Most Daoist sects and schools, and CCT generally, teach that religious truths are embedded in virtually all levels and facets of reality. Access to those truths is available largely through the mediation of ritual specialists and spiritual masters. Their task is not so much to disclose the mysteries as to facilitate the passage of power from the realm of gods and spirits to that of human beings. When ordinary people find themselves in the neighborhood of these spiritual powers, the truth behind them remains mysterious and cloaked in ambiguity. There are, however, accounts in which famous masters and sages claim to have received explicit revelations or missions directly from a deity. When Deists speak of the language of revelation in these relatively rare instances, they suggest that they are pointing only to the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. The whole truth remains hidden from view and available only to a select few. This contrasts markedly with the general thrust of the Abrahamic traditions, for example, where revelation implies the disclosure of the full truth insofar as human beings can fathom it. Finally, an experience called divination writing deserves mention here, since it is occasionally described as a revelatory medium. The Shangqing school claims to be based on a series of nocturnal revelations. Founder Yang Shi reported that heavenly beings came to him in a vision and caused his hand to write the sacred texts.
What has the swastika got to do with Buddhism?
A revolving cross with bent cross beams. The swastika has been a symbol of longevity and success throughout Eastern Asia for millennia. Buddhists inherited the symbol from Hindu tradition, in which it referred to different forms of cosmic energy. Depending on whether the symbol rotated to the right or to the left, the symbol appears often in Chinese sculpture on the upper chest of the Buddha. There it is a reminder of the eternal validity of his teaching. A meaning attached to the Chinese use of the swastika as the number 10,000. In some Japanese temples, such as the Asakusa Kannon Temple in Tokyo, the swastika even functions as the central icon on the main altar, replacing the image of the Buddha. Zen tradition sees the swastika as a symbol of the Buddha mind handed down from teacher to disciple. It may have become associated with the Buddha as a result of his identification with solar imagery and power. Some suggest that the swastika symbolizes the Buddha's teaching as an abstract stylized version of the will of Dharma.
Do Buddhists use special symbols when they engage in personal or private rituals?
A number of prayer aids and other ritual accoutrements are common in many Buddhist households. Prayer wheels and prayer flags, used especially in the Himalayan nations but elsewhere as well, symbolize the belief in the ideal of continual prayer. Prayer wheels contain bits of sacred text inside a small drum fitted with an axle-like handle. A short weighted chain attached to the drum makes it easier to spin it steadily. Prayer flags are strips of cloth containing sacred text and petitions, prayers sped aloft by the winds. Many Japanese households have a small altar, called the Butsudan, in which families keep tablets with the names of deceased relatives as well as images of the Buddha. In general, private rituals employ a scaled-down set of the same principal symbols used for temple worship.
In brief, what is the history of religious Daoism?
Religious Daoism emerged as a recognizable tradition in its own right during the latter decades of the Han Dynasty, 202 BCE to 221 CE. Confucianism enjoyed imperial favor as the official creed of the state. But when the Han Dynasty disintegrated, both Daoism and Buddhism found room to grow. The early Celestial Masters school dominated the Daoist scene for the most part. Various schools teaching forms of alchemical Daoism developed early on and have continued throughout the past 2,000 years. In addition, new revelations claimed by various teachers gave rise to several new schools between the 3rd and 6th centuries, times of political fragmentation. See below for discussion of individual schools and denominations. With political reunification during the Sui, 581 to 618, dynasty, Daoism's various schools managed to survive in spite of meager imperial support. Many monasteries flourished but remained apart from the general populace. Things improved under the Tang dynasty, 618 to 906, when Daoists once again had friends in high places. Under the Song dynasty, 960-1279, Neo-Confucianism proved a powerful rival for Daoists at court. But Daoists fared well anyway, since many Neo-Confucians gladly exchanged ideas with Daoism's leading lights. During the Southern Song dynasty, 1127 to 1279. In spite of an almost complete lack of public imperial patronage, several new Daoist schools sprang up. Things took a turn for the worse under the Yuan dynasty, 1260 to 1368. Daoists invited to participate in court debates suffered serious setbacks and paid dearly with the loss of monasteries and precious libraries. During the late medieval Ming dynasty, 1368 to 1644, Daoist fortunes improved again dramatically and many Daoist masters enjoyed prominent official positions. But under the last of the imperial regimes, the Qing, or Manchu, dynasty, 1644 to 1911, the pendulum swung the other way and religious Daoism struggled to survive the early modern period. Through the periods of the First Chinese Republic, 1912 to 1949, and the People's Republic, 1949 to present, Daoism has held on largely thanks to the establishment of several organizations designed to provide a public presence for the various orders and schools. After disastrous losses as a result of the Cultural Revolution, 1966–76. Deist religious groups are again struggling to pull themselves back together.
What is the meaning of Buddhist ordination?
Ordination in the Buddhist tradition does not imply the same kind of conferral of spiritual power or authority that it does in many Christian denominations. A closer parallel would be the taking of religious vows. Young men and boys in many Buddhist denominations submit themselves for ordination to the monastic sangha under a variety of circumstances. In some cultures, boys as young as 7 can enter the monastery and receive the lower ordination, Parivraja, to the rank of novice in the order. Those who choose to stay and commit themselves to the monastic life permanently can receive the higher ordination, Upasampada, to full status of monk or bhikshu. Ordinations are often held at the start of the rain retreat, and it is not unusual for young ordinands to remain in the monastery only for one rainy season. Thai men sometimes still enter the monastery for a week or less after the death of a family member. In some areas, ordinations occur after rice harvest, since increased revenue makes for better celebrations. But the rituals can occur anytime outside of the rain retreat itself. Prospective ordinands petition the abbot of a local monastery, who might then allow them indirectly if they intend only a short stay. Those who propose to remain and take the full monastic ordination eventually go through a more elaborate ritual. They kneel before 10 monks and the abbot, ask permission to enter, and receive the 2-piece robe of the novice. After donning the garb, the candidates recite the 3 refuges and 10 precepts. Ordination to full membership in the monastic order repeats the novitiate ritual and adds a further examination of the candidates. Each novice receives a begging bowl and a 3-piece garment.
What are some helpful clues for understanding Buddhist iconography?
Most important of all are images of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Buddhist sculpture and painting have evolved in many different styles. Each lineage or denomination has a number of symbols and signs to which it assigns special meanings. But it is possible to suggest some general features to look for when you visit a museum's Asian galleries. As with Hindu iconography, start by noting posture, gesture, garb, and other implements. Buddha images are usually seated in the lotus posture, legs crossed so that the soles of the feet face upward. Some images depict the Buddha standing or walking, but these are less numerous. Principal gestures include those that indicate blessing, teaching, or meditation. One of the most important has the left hand resting palm up in the lap and the right touching the ground just in front of the right knee, symbolizing the Buddha's conquest of Mara's temptation. Buddha images are typically clad in simple monk's garb and do not hold any specific tools or implements. Bodhisattvas sometimes appear seated in a relaxed posture called royal ease. But standing images are more common. They ordinarily wear crowns and royal finery as symbols of the life of the Buddha to be prior to his renunciation. Seated bodhisattvas often recline graciously forward and offer a gesture of kindly welcome or special attentiveness. Some bodhisattvas have multiple arms and heads to symbolize their infinite power and ability to respond to every human need. In their many hands, these potent images can carry as many as several dozen separate items, including weapons, musical instruments, and symbols of healing. Guardian figures are the most numerous subordinate images, distant cousins of beings with similar functions in Hindu tradition. These characters glower menacingly on beings of evil intent and brandish weaponry sufficient to dispatch all undesirable elements daring to approach the holy place.
What good are the deities then?
They, along with the spiritually accomplished ones called sages and immortals, instruct humankind in the ways to achieve salvation. A clue to the place of many of these celestial beings in the grand scheme of things is their connection with the stars. Dozens of the members of the Taoist and popular Chinese pantheons are or have been associated with specific heavenly bodies or constellations. They are thus both visible and impossibly distant.
What good are the deities then?
They, along with the spiritually accomplished ones called sages and immortals, instruct humankind in the ways to achieve salvation. A clue to the place of many of these celestial beings in the grand scheme of things is their connection with the stars. Dozens of the members of the Taoist and popular Chinese pantheons are or have been associated with specific heavenly bodies or constellations. They are thus both visible and impossibly distant.
Who are some of the chief Taoist deities?
Bearing in mind that it is not always possible to draw neat distinctions between Taoist divinities and those of CCT. Here are some of the figures that appear to have at least originated in Taoist circles. They are called the earlier heaven deities. At the top of the pantheon are the three pure ones, Sansheng. They seem to have been Taoism's theological rejoinder to the Buddhist groupings in which bodhisattvas flank Amitabha Buddha to form a celestial triad. The three pure ones, or sacred beings, are named after the heavens in which they dwell. The heavens of the jade, higher, and great purity, respectively. This triad evidently developed out of a trio of deified human beings of history or legend. Lao Zi, known as Tian Shang Lao Jun, Lord of the Daoist teaching, was the first so elevated. Later a deity called Heavenly Venerable of the original beginning, Yuan Shi Tianzun, was named as chief deity. And still later a third deity, Grand Lord of the Dao, Tai Shang Dao Jun, leapfrogged the two others to the top of the triad. These three, often depicted as enthroned elders, came to be identified with the more transcendent and abstract pure ones. Many consider the deified Lao Zi still a separate deity who ranks above the three pure ones. The Jade Emperor, Yu Huangdadi, was eventually identified either as the chief deity's younger brother or as an incarnation of the Lord of the Heaven of Great Purity, and became the prominent deity in some CCT cults. According to one theological model, the three pure ones are manifestations of the primordial cosmic energy, Qi.
Who are some of the chief Daoist deities?
Bearing in mind that it is not always possible to draw neat distinctions between Daoist divinities and those of CCT. Here are some of the figures that appear to have at least originated in Daoist circles. They are called the earlier heaven deities. At the top of the pantheon are the three pure ones, Sansheng. They seem to have been Daoism's theological rejoinder to the Buddhist groupings in which bodhisattvas flank Amitabha Buddha to form a celestial triad. The three pure ones, or sacred beings, are named after the heavens in which they dwell. The heavens of the jade, higher, and great purity, respectively. This triad evidently developed out of a trio of deified human beings of history or legend. Lao Zi, known as Tian Shang Lao Jun, Lord of the Daoist teaching, was the first so elevated. Later a deity called Heavenly Venerable of the original beginning, Yuan Shi Tianzun, was named as chief deity. And still later a third deity, Grand Lord of the Dao, Tai Shang Dao Jun, leapfrogged the two others to the top of the triad. These three, often depicted as enthroned elders, came to be identified with the more transcendent and abstract pure ones. Many consider the deified Lao Zi still a separate deity who ranks above the three pure ones. The Jade Emperor, Yu Huangdadi, was eventually identified either as the chief deity's younger brother or as an incarnation of the Lord of the Heaven of Great Purity, and became the prominent deity in some CCT cults. According to one theological model, the three pure ones are manifestations of the primordial cosmic energy, Qi.
How did Lao Zi become deified?
There seem to have been a number of stages in that process. First, the legendary figure began as a teacher and writer. whose image eventually blended with that of the Yellow Emperor when Lao Zi came to be identified as a confidant of royalty. Traditional accounts, such as the life story summarized above, transformed him into a cultural hero whose mother had conceived him virginally. By the mid-2nd century CE, Lao Zi had become the deity who delivered to Zhang Dao Ling the revelation of a new religious faith, giving rise to the Celestial Masters' School. But his image was still not complete. Next, perhaps also around the 2nd or 3rd century CE, Lao Zi seems to have been identified as a creator god who also enters the world to rescue humanity from tribulation. Lao Zi was now capable of incarnating himself, almost like a Buddhist bodhisattva. Not long thereafter he joined the triad of the three pure ones. And finally Lao Zi emerged as the chief divine person. We have here one of the more interesting examples of apotheosis, or deification, in the history of religion.
How did Lao Zi become deified?
There seem to have been a number of stages in that process. First, the legendary figure began as a teacher and writer, whose image eventually blended with that of the Yellow Emperor when Lao Zi came to be identified as a confidant of royalty. Traditional accounts, such as the life story summarized above, transformed him into a cultural hero whose mother had conceived him virginally. By the mid-2nd century CE, Lao Zi had become the deity who delivered to Zhang Dao Ling the revelation of a new religious faith, giving rise to the Celestial Masters' School. But his image was still not complete. Next, perhaps also around the 2nd or 3rd century CE, Lao Zi seems to have been identified as a creator god who also enters the world to rescue humanity from tribulation. Lao Zi was now capable of incarnating himself, almost like a Buddhist bodhisattva. Not long thereafter he joined the triad of the three pure ones. And finally Lao Zi emerged as the chief divine person. We have here one of the more interesting examples of apotheosis, or deification, in the history of religion.
Are there any other important deist sacred figures?
One important subordinate deity is Xian Tian Shangdi, Supreme Emperor of Dark Heaven. The Jade Emperor dispatched him to Earth to battle a band of renegade demon kings. His iconography shows him enthroned and using a serpent and a turtle, leaders of the demons, as a footstool. A legendary woman named Shi Wang Mu, also known as the Queen Mother of the West, figures prominently in some deist writings. She is a patroness of immortality, often depicted in the company of jade maidens, one carrying a fan and the other a bushel of the peaches of longevity. Ruling the east is her divine consort, Dung Wang Gong, who lives in the remote magical fastness of the Kunlun Mountains. In a reversal of the more usual dynamic, a god of walls and moats, also known as the city god, began as a popular deity and made his way into the deist pantheon. During certain periods in history, the heavenly master appointed a given city's tutelary deity. City god has the assistance of several other figures, called spirit secretaries, in the idiom of public administration. They help the city god deliver his reports on the conduct of citizens to the authorities in hell. A goddess named Domu, mother of the bushel of stars, or northern dipper, functions in Daoism much the way Guanyin does in Buddhism, offering limitless compassion for the suffering. Some other potent beings are clustered in groups. The Sennin are a group of sacred figures who dwell in heaven or in the distant misty mountains. Among the Sennin the most important are the 8 immortals. Originally persons either historical, 3, or legendary. 5, they function as guardian figures of Daoism. Although they are not officially divine, popular lore sometimes attributes divine powers to them. They are called later heaven deities, as are all human figures who eventually achieved immortality.
Are there any other important deist sacred figures?
One important subordinate deity is Xiantian Shangdi, Supreme Emperor of Dark Heaven. The Jade Emperor dispatched him to Earth to battle a band of renegade demon kings. His iconography shows him enthroned and using a serpent and a turtle, leaders of the demons, as a footstool. A legendary woman named Shi Wangmu, also known as the Queen Mother of the West, figures prominently in some Daoist writings. She is a patroness of immortality, often depicted in the company of jade maidens, one carrying a fan and the other a bushel of the peaches of longevity. Ruling the east is her divine consort, Dung Wanggong, who lives in the remote magical fastness of the Kunlun Mountains. In a reversal of the more usual dynamic, a god of walls and moats, also known as the city god, began as a popular deity and made his way into the Daoist pantheon. During certain periods in history, the heavenly master appointed a given city's tutelary deity. City god has the assistance of several other figures, called spirit secretaries, in the idiom of public administration. They help the city god deliver his reports on the conduct of citizens to the authorities in hell. A goddess named Domu, mother of the bushel of stars, or northern dipper, functions in Daoism much the way Guanyin does in Buddhism, offering limitless compassion for the suffering. Some other potent beings are clustered in groups. The Sennin are a group of sacred figures who dwell in heaven or in the distant misty mountains. Among the Sennin the most important are the 8 immortals. Originally persons either historical, 3, or legendary. 5, they function as guardian figures of Daoism. Although they are not officially divine, popular lore sometimes attributes divine powers to them. They are called later heaven deities, as are all human figures who eventually achieved immortality.